project of the African Methodist Episcopal Church Publishing House, committed to reducing the stigma of HIV in Black faith communities. And tonight we are delighted to be joined by Araya Baker as we think together about how to reduce the risks of stigma in our communities and stigma's effect on mental health. For previous workshops and for other resources, you can visit www.imame.org. But for tonight's broadcast, let me introduce you to our presenter, Araya Baker, who is a psychotherapist, journalist, and public health leader. For a decade now, Araya has contributed to social justice and human rights movements, primarily by lending support to people over profit-oriented artist coalitions, political campaigns, nonprofit organizations, research centers, think tanks, and public school systems. Araya's clinical background has included positions with the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline and Mental Health America. Their writing and political commentary have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and Psychology Today, among many other global outlets. And their activism has been recognized by Essence magazine. In case you can't tell, Araya is well experienced and well recognized, and they are well educated, having received a Master's of Philosophy degree in professional counseling from the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, where they received the Award for Excellence in Promoting Diversity and Inclusion, and having earned the Master's of Education degree in Human Development and Psychology from the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where they served as an Equity and Inclusion Fellow. Won't you join me in welcoming Araya Baker?
Thank you for that warm introduction, Reverend Davis. I will now share my screen and we can get started. Alrighty. Welcome to the Cultivating Stigma-Free Congregations webinar. Today, we're going to talk about different strategies to combat stigma in places of worship in faith communities. I'll be talking a little bit about stigma related to HIV, mental health, as well as other forms of stigma throughout the presentation. So first, we'll get started with an overview of what we'll discuss today. The first thing that we'll discuss are our learning objectives. We'll go over what the takeaways are from this webinar and what you need to sort of pay attention to throughout the webinar in terms of what applies to your specific faith community or congregation. We'll then delve into the topic of stigma, sort of unpacking what stigma is, the toll that stigma takes on different communities, and the different forms and methods that stigma plays out as when our interactions with others and in our interactions with different institutions. After overviewing stigma, we will pivot to the why of stigma. So we will talk about why stigma persists, even though we don't enjoy being labeled and stereotyped ourselves. There are certain implicit biases that are sort of ingrained in us as people that lead us to perpetuate stigma, sometimes accidentally and inadvertently. Then we'll sort of wrap up or shift gears toward wrapping up and talk about the how of anti-stigma. And so what this means is breaking down the different strategies that you can apply and employ in your specific faith community as it relates to yourself. So the internal work of unlearning stigma, but also as it applies to your leadership within your congregation. Then we will just briefly summarize some takeaways and delve into comments and questions. So first things first, learning objectives. There are 3 learning objectives, the first being to identify the categories, methods, and cultural messages of stigma, in addition to various outcomes of internalized stigma. The second objective is to understand how and which automatic assumptions and implicit biases drive stigmatization of others. And lastly, to learn skills relevant to unlearning stigma within oneself and scaling up these skills to an organizational level through destigmatizing leadership practices. So the what of stigma. I thought that we would begin with this powerful quote by James Baldwin, one of my favorite authors. And it says, "It took many years of vomiting up all the filth I'd been taught about myself and half believed before I was able to walk on the earth as though I had a right to be here." Defining stigma. So what is stigma? Stigma is defined as the disapproval of or discrimination against an individual or group based on perceived characteristics that serve to distinguish them from other members of a society. Social stigmas are commonly related to culture, gender, race, socioeconomic status, age, sexual orientation, body image, physical disability, intelligence or lack thereof, and health. Some stigma may be obvious, while others are known as concealable stigmas that must be revealed through disclosure. And whenever we're defining something, it can be helpful to know what other terms or concepts are associated with that particular term or concept. And so I have included synonyms for the word stigma. You can see here that some of the synonyms are blemish, contempt, disgrace, dishonor, stain, taboo, tarnish, words that have negative connotations around someone's status or around others' perceptions of them. In addition to this definition and similar words, there are 4 categories of stigma to keep in mind. So public stigma, we'll talk about public stigmas all throughout the webinar, stigmas that we grow up with and are internalized from the dominant culture and dominant narratives in our culture. We also have self-stigma. This is when stigma becomes internalized and we self-stigmatize through self-loathing or self-contempt. And this is learned through our observations and interactions with other people and how they treat us. There's also associative stigma that can result from being associated with someone who's stigmatizing or from a stigmatized group. And so this might look like someone being anxious about being seen with someone who has a particular identity or is in a particular circumstance and fearful that whatever is attributed to that person may transfer onto them. We also have institutional stigma. So institutional stigma speaks to the values of an institution, what is seen as good, bad, what is seen as aspirational, what is seen as failure, success, all of these norms that we find within institutions that are sometimes spoken, sometimes not. And lastly, we have methods of stigmatization. So when we talk about stigma, it's important to remember there are a whole host of behaviors that fall under the umbrella of stigma. Some of them look like bullying, disowning, exiling, hierarchizing, so creating hierarchies of worth that apply to individuals or groups, humiliating people, ignoring or silencing, pathologizing, meaning that you sort of create a narrative that something is inherently defective about someone, typically mentally, as well as shaming, stereotyping, and victim blaming. So there's so many stigmas that exist that chances are all of us have felt stigmatized at some point in time. These are just a few of the common ones. So teenage pregnancy, for example, divorce, getting remarried after divorce, infertility or miscarriage, so problems around reproducing, sexually transmitted infections, unemployment, homelessness, mental illness and disability, whether physical or psychiatric, addiction, aging, also weight and size. So if you take a moment to just review this list, you can think of at least one probably that applies to something that you experienced in your life or someone that you know who might represent the associative stigma that we just talked about. Stigma is prevalent throughout our society, and there have been many surveys and studies that show that people are very inhibited by stigma, especially when it comes to seeking help for health issues, for any type of service that they might need. And so within the context of a congregation, these studies can be highly relevant because for some people, congregations are the primary organization or community that people reach out to when they're in a time of need. So we can see here that only 16.5% of individuals with depression worldwide seek help. Up to 40% of pregnant teenagers feel stigmatized by their pregnancy. 46% of unemployed people have lied about being out of work. 53% of people considered overweight or obese reported to have received inappropriate comments from their doctor about their weight. Only 43% of Americans are comfortable interacting with people living with HIV in various scenarios. And so a lot of these studies reveal that although in our day-to-day interactions, people's biases and their internalized stigmas may not be obvious. You know, you may be a part of a community where it feels on the surface as if everyone is truly welcome. And yet, when you ask people in private what their views are about specific groups or specific identities, specific life circumstances, you find out that their personal beliefs can be very different than what they show on the surface. People can also feel more stigma about a situation or an identity when it applies to them and people that they know versus others. So how does stigma get internalized within ourselves? We are all products of our environment, of our culture, of our socialization. And so basically this word socialization means how we are sort of, and I want to stay away from the implication that this is indoctrination, but how we are sort of molded and shaped by the people raising us, by the institutions in our society, and by the everyday experiences that we have that send us particular messages about the value and the worth of different people and different labels. And so to the left, you can see the cycle of socialization. Particularly, this focuses on how we learn classism and racism. And so we see that at the top, family socialization plays a big part in shaping our belief system. Parents and others we trust shape our values, teach us rules, and teach us roles. From there, we learn stereotypes, language, meaning labels, and traditions. And by the time we get out into the world and become part of different institutions, whether that be a church, a school, Boy Scouts, whatever, we have sort of introduced ourselves to cultural socialization. And what we find is that a lot of the stigmas or beliefs in general that our family implanted in us are reinforced within these organizations and institutions. At that point, we are bombarded with messages from schools, media, songs, religion, doctors, businesses, ads that send us messages about who we are. And we carry those messages on as adults. We can internalize them and feel guilty about certain aspects of who we are. We can feel self-hatred. We can feel sort of dehumanized by society at large, or when it comes to the stigmatization of other people, we can be silent and sort of complicit in their subjugation because we have seen through observation that other people get mistreated when they try to stand up for people who are being stigmatized. Um, to the right, I don't know if this is on your right side, but to my right side, you can see some different aspects of socialization, particularly around messaging. So messages can be implied or overt. You can feel as if someone is very transparent about their beliefs about a certain group or identity or situation, life circumstance or situation, or it can simply be implied. Messages can also be observed through secondhand experience, referencing someone else's situation and how they were mistreated, how they were devalued, or messaging can be experienced firsthand, something that's directly communicated to you, non-verbally or verbally. Messaging and messages can be conditioned through reward and punishment. And so a lot of this boils down to sort of behavioral conditioning. When we live up to a certain expectation, we are often rewarded through compliments, rewarded through attention, rewarded through resources. And yet, when we deviate from those norms, oftentimes we are punished, either through silence and being ignored, or through mistreatment, like humiliation, or being completely exiled from a community. And in addition to that, messaging is reinforced across institutions and social systems. So as I just explained with reference to the diagram, schools, the media, religious institutions, medical institutions, businesses, consumer ads, all of those things play a role in reinforcing the sort of validity or the perceived validity of these stigmas that we see. We can feel like that doesn't seem right to me, that this group is mistreated. But when we see the message reinforced so pervasively, we know that it's best that we adhere to that norm or else we get punished. And then lastly, although stigmatization is something that is very harmful, it is still something that is often done through very legal and moral means, primarily through criminalizing things or pathologizing certain identities, certain behaviors that sort of stigmatize a group of people and therefore help other people justify avoiding being in that situation or avoiding others in that situation. So as it relates to spirituality and faith, introducing stigma into faith communities can result in spiritual trauma. You can see on the green side the definition of spiritual trauma as the mistreatment of a person who is in need of help, support, or greater spiritual empowerment with the result of weakening, undermining, or decreasing that person's spiritual empowerment. Spiritual trauma usually occurs when leaders use their spiritual position to control or dominate another person, and when power is used to bolster the position or needs of a leader. I'm going to use my cursor to draw your attention to one section of this questionnaire, which is called the Spiritual Harm and Abuse Scale. And down here, you can see different domains of spiritual trauma that people can endorse, different experiences. And some of them include identities. And some of them include situations that, if we go back to our list of common stigmas, are here. And so we see things like, I was treated less than because of my race or sexual orientation. I was pressured to stay in an abusive marriage by religious leaders. I was deterred from seeking mental health care. All of these experiences relate to spiritual trauma and that people were denied choice and agency because of stigma and because of labels that were stigmatizing. So now we're getting into the why of stigma. With all that said, most of us can relate to stigma. Most of us have been in situations where we've been stigmatized. We know how it feels. We know that when we're stigmatized, we don't feel permission to be who we truly are. We don't feel permission to speak up. We don't feel permission to really lean into authenticity and vulnerability in a way that allows us to connect genuinely with other people. And so the question becomes, why do we do it? And a lot of that boils down to what's in this section, the why of stigma. I've included a quote by Toni Morrison to sort of capture what we're going to be talking about. And the quote goes, "If you can only feel tall when someone else is on their knees, you have a serious problem." And yet, that is exactly how stigma gets perpetuated a lot of times. So briefly, I'm going to talk about implicit biases that drive stigmatization. If you're not familiar with the term implicit bias, it is simply a bias or a prejudice that lies beneath one's own consciousness. And we have these implicit biases about different identities, race, for example. People might have implicit biases about a Black coworker, for example. But we also have these broader implicit biases about how the world works in general. And so here are three implicit biases that sort of are the underlying mechanisms of how stigma gets perpetuated. First, we have social comparison theory, which is the belief that there is a drive within individuals to gain accurate self-evaluations. The theory explains how individuals evaluate their own opinions and abilities by comparing themselves to others to reduce uncertainty in these domains and learn how to define the self. What does all that mean? Basically, we are all on this journey, this quest to figure out who we are, to delineate ourselves from other people as we're amidst other people and groups and organizations. We're all faced with this sort of dichotomy of wanting to be a part of a larger group, but at the same time wanting to sort of specify and become clearer and have more clarity about who we are as people. And oftentimes we do that by comparing ourselves against others, looking for a standard, looking for a norm, looking for some norm or standard that can reassure us that we're good enough, that we're adequate, that we are like everyone else. Even though we might want to be a little different, there's a part of all of us that also wants to be accepted. This can be problematic because we can look at other people or look at groups and see a norm and think that that norm is just the way that things are supposed to be. If everyone is doing this, or if everyone seems to behave in this way so casually, that must mean that if I don't feel that way, something is wrong with me. And as it relates to stigma, that can apply to other people. Once we see someone who's different than the norm, we can single them out and we can devalue them because of social comparison theory. Next, we have just world phenomenon, which is the cognitive bias that assumes that people get what they deserve always. The actions will necessarily have morally fair and fitting consequences for the actor. What does all that mean? Basically, it means that we sort of look at situations that others find themselves in, and we oftentimes rush to conclusions. We don't have all the information. We don't have the full context of what led them to be in that predicament, and yet we presume that because they are in this unfortunate circumstance, they must have done something to deserve the contempt that the world is throwing on them. And so we try to justify, in a nutshell, we try to justify sort of moral apathy and the coldness of the world. We see people get devalued because of their life circumstance, their identity, their group affiliations, and we think, well, I don't want to be associated with them. So the easiest way for me to rationalize turning away and not looking and feeling upset is to believe and convince myself that they did something they faltered along the way to deserve to be in that predicament. Lastly, we have in-group favoritism. And this is a pattern of favoring members of one's in-group over out-group members. This can be expressed in evaluation of others, in allocation of resources, and in many other ways. And so social comparison theory sort of regards how we can measure that we're good enough. Just world phenomenon sort of regards how we look at other people and judge whether they're good or bad enough. And then in-group favoritism is like the culmination of that. It's how we view the status of our own group. And oftentimes we assume that there are better qualities, better attributes, and more diversity within our own group than other groups, which is problematic because it can lead us to believe that people in the out group, the them versus the us, the them, that all of them are the same, that they're a monolith and that there's no diversity of thought or no diversity of thought, no diversity of belief, no diversity of morality or just lived experience among other people. And so we can feel like, oh, I already know what all the people who identify as XYZ are like. I don't need to go over and sort of diversify my own exposure because I know what they're like. This is what society says they're like. Why do I need to explore more? With all that explained, we can now move into the how of anti-stigma. And for this section, I have included a quote by Bell Hooks that sort of encapsulates the strategies that people sometimes use to be stigmatizing right before we talk about the strategies that you can use to sort of combat stigma. And so the quote is, "Sometimes people try to destroy you precisely because they recognize your power, not because they don't see it, but because they see it and they don't want it to exist." And so as we talk about strategies for unlearning stigma and bias, it's important to remember that a lot of this is about power and power struggles. And people struggle to sort of define who they are through this lens of, well, I want to be the one in control. I want to be the one in power. And the easiest way for most people to assert that is to point out who deviates from the powerful group. One way to unlearn stigma personally is to positionality map. What does that mean? Positionality simply means the culmination of all your identities. So when we all have a constellation of identities, and you can see on the wheel of power privilege, there are many different categories from citizenship, skin color, formal education, ability, sexuality, neurodiversity, meaning mental capacity, mental health, meaning emotional stability, body size, housing status, wealth, language, gender. We all have a status within these sort of domains of identity. And so it's important for us to sit and reflect about how we are perceived by others and also how we perceive ourselves. And from there, reflecting on which of these identities that I hold are stigmatized. And with regard to other people, which of their identities that, at least that I know about, might be stigmatized? And how does this inform how they're showing up? How does this inform why they might be in a particular life circumstance that, because of my own privileged identity, I have greater chances of just circumventing that altogether? Or maybe I do find myself in that same situation, but I have greater odds of faring it okay and making it out unscathed. And so it's important to remember, one thing that I always tell people is that privilege doesn't mean that you're a bad person to be privileged in a particular category. And it's not always about what advantage you have in materially. It's not always about wealth. It's not always about a benefit that you didn't earn. Sometimes it's simply about what you don't have to go through, the barriers that you don't have to tear down, that you don't have to jump over, leap over before you can keep going. And as we think about identity, it's also important to keep in mind that some identities are visible and others are invisible. So there are certain things that you can size up by looking people up and down. And there are other things that you would have no clue about until you had a conversation with them. And so that goes back to the definition of stigma, and how some stigmas are concealable. Equally, some identities are concealable, and some identities also need to be disclosed in order for them to be stigmatized. So thinking about all of that can be really important as you interact with other people and as you catch yourself making assumptions about the circumstances that they find themselves in, that you may look on the surface and think, I would never be in that situation. But little do you know, it has something to do with their identity and things beyond their control. Another aspect of unlearning stigma is to integrate your idea of who someone is on an individual level, and highlighting their differences with the fact that we all have universal needs. And as a therapist, that's something that it's a balance that I'm constantly striving to strike. Okay, this person who is in front of me, I know this, and this about them, which makes them a really unique individual. At the same time, what are their needs as a person, as a human being? And so on the right side, you can see Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And as we move beyond the basic physical needs and safety needs, we get into higher level needs that sometimes border on spiritual needs. Love, a sense of belongingness, meaningful recognition from others, the need to be well thought of by oneself as well as by others. So self-esteem, self-worth. And all of this sort of supports self-actualization, or people's capacity to live up to their potential. And so when we talk about stigma, it's not just the negative statistics about depression or about suicide or about homelessness. All of those things are definitely very real outcomes. But even if someone isn't at risk for those outcomes, they can still suffer from being stigmatized simply by feeling rejected from a community, or feeling as if they don't have the gifts that everyone else seems to have because something about them is different. And so this can be helpful. This integration can be helpful in thinking through how to ensure that every member of a congregation feels empowered. And lastly, as far as unlearning stigma personally, thinking about what sources you rely on to try to understand more about yourself and others and the world, the past, the present. And I've included some books and one podcast that you might want to refer to, a pretty diverse group of faith leaders and a really wide array of topics that they've written and spoken on. And leaning into a diverse array of media can be really important, especially in a society where there's a lot of not only misinformation, but disinformation that can lead you down the road of fearing certain groups or having contempt for certain groups without really understanding, again, the full context of their lived reality. And I also just included historical literacy, because sometimes there are certain situations, certain realities, certain phenomenon that we see in the world that we think is not only unusual, but is new. And so we might attribute that to, people being lost spiritually, people, our generations being lost spiritually, when really this is something that has always been a thing. It's just been beneath your radar. Or you may not understand the full history of that particular thing. So now that we have a few tools for unlearning stigma on a personal level, we can delve into how to promote the unlearning of stigma on an organizational level. So this applies to leadership within congregations. So organizationally, it can be important to embody certain leadership values and practices that send a message to followers, to congregants, that this is a safe space, that this is a space where everyone is welcome. This is a space where diversity is celebrated, and not just identity, but diversity of thought, diversity of backgrounds. And this is a place where people speak up when certain groups are excluded or devalued or silenced. There is a way to work that out. And that can be helpful because going back to what we discussed regarding spiritual trauma, a lot of times people leave faith communities because of negative experiences. And that can create a missed opportunity for faith communities to draw people in, to have engagement as an organization, but also to create a community that is spiritually nourishing. And so these are three strategies that leaders can reflect on and try out in their own congregations. The first is shared decision-making power, which fosters the inclusive climate necessary to uncover assumptions and highlight oversights when you're making important decisions. And most importantly, it involves checks and balances. And people from stigmatized groups oftentimes have sort of been betrayed by institutions, by social systems. And so the perception that there's a checks and balances system to decision making can make people from stigmatized backgrounds feel more at ease, like they have a stake in creating and shaping the environment. And it's not just the power to make decisions, it's not just limited to people from privileged backgrounds. And that goes into the next strategy, creating equitable opportunities for leadership. So making sure that leadership is open to people from all backgrounds and seeing it as an opportunity when people from stigmatized backgrounds can take on a leadership role and sort of defy people's expectations about who is meant or anointed to be in that role. And sometimes we've seen different leadership positions or people in leadership positions look a certain way for so long that we cannot imagine someone else of a different background, a different positionality occupying that role. And so the value of creating equitable opportunities for leadership boils down to associating good leadership with objective qualities rather than socially privileged identities. And also, it creates opportunities for congregants to desensationalize stigmatized groups. So what does that mean? It basically provides opportunities for folks who've never come across someone who might be a convicted felon, who might have recovered from addiction, who might have been homeless for a decade. They've never come across someone like that. They may have a lot of myths, a lot of misconceptions, a lot of preconceived ideas about who someone from that background is. And yet, when they see someone from that background step into a leadership role and execute things well and steer the congregation in a positive direction, that can change their entire perception about the credibility and the gifts and the value of someone from that stigmatized group. And lastly, confidential climate assessment. This is something that we sort of overlook in faith communities. We tend to rely on word of mouth to get a pulse of how people feel. But sometimes it can be helpful to have an actual climate assessment, whether that be a town hall or an actual paper survey that you give out or an online survey. And I've included the sort of qualifier that it be confidential because a lot of times in faith communities, I'm sure you know, um, gossip is prevalent and things get shared in confidence that somehow get out to other people. And that can create a real distrust among the congregation and also can sort of undermine your efforts to make sure that people trust leaders to be ethical. And so the main benefit of assessing climate is that it safeguards congregations from a fearful institutional culture of intimidation or retaliation. And that can be very, very helpful and reassuring for folks from stigmatized backgrounds, because again, a lot of times they've had really, really harsh experiences with different institutions. People might be multiply marginalized in more than one category if we think back to the identity wheel. And so every institution they've joined, they might feel themselves to be on the margins of the margins. And so reassuring them that there is a space and a mechanism to really hear their concerns, to voice their concerns, can really, really go a long way in terms of getting their buy-in. Again, getting their buy-in and convincing them that, yes, okay, sure, we're not all perfect. We all have a lot to unlearn with regard to stigma. But if something does happen, there is a way within this faith community to work through that and to reach an understanding, to have generative conflict that helps everyone grow. And so now we can turn it back over to Reverend Davis to discuss any comments or questions that folks might have about anything that we discussed.
Thank you, Araya, for this really rich and generative workshop. I think it's left us with a lot to think about and some really helpful challenges, as well as some really helpful information. I'm sure that for many of us, some of the language around stigma is utilized so frequently, but perhaps not with the fullest understanding of what it is and why it is. There are a few questions that some of our partner congregations have posed, some of which you answered already, but there are two that I do want to lift up just to get your response on.
Sure.
The first is if you can speak a little bit more about the relationship between stigma within oneself and the stigmatization of others. I feel like that's not often as talked about in conversations around stigma, is how it can be internalized into a sort of self-loathing.
Mhm.
So, one of the questions, for instance, is thinking through how we might project, some of that stigma onto others, and it's really what we're holding, ourselves hostage to. So, can you speak
Mhm.
more to how we can come to terms with our own internalized stigma?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's really, really hard because going back to that cycle of socialization diagram, it started with family. And so a lot of times the stigmas that we internalize come from the people that we love and that we care about the most. And so it can be really hard for people to reconcile, okay, I really, really, really love dad, mom, whoever. And at the same time, there have been certain messages that have been invalidating or disempowering. And so I think that is one reason why, for many people, self stigma just sort of festers because it's so hard to make sense of, how to move forward and have an honest conversation about it when the very people who sort of implanted it are folks that you might feel uncomfortable critiquing. And the other part of that is that sometimes when we see other people give themselves permission to be who we have always been denied, um, it can be triggering for some folks. It can set them off because it can make it seem like, well, I went through all of this socialization and followed the rules, thinking that that's what would, make others see me as a good person. And yet you're, the opposite, and you still see yourself as a good person. How is that so?
Yeah, that's a really helpful response, particularly I think for many of these, for many of our ways in which the families are equal parts of our faith communities. So we're not just hearing these messages at home, but this is perhaps also who's leading our Sunday school class or preaching, leading in
Hmm.
choir. So there is a really interesting
Hmm.
way in which those narratives become intertwined with spirituality, with theology.
Absolutely.
The second question, um, you were getting to this in the end, which and the framing of your workshop was really helpful, even kind of centering each of those sections through Baldwin, Morrison, and Hooks was really helpful. As we think toward what it looks like to unlearn stigma and to work against stigma at the institutional level, in addition to those three kind of large scale practices that you shared, what are smaller practices that particularly clergy and lay leaders
Mm-hmm.
who aren't in the pulpit,
Hmm.
what are
Hmm.
small things that people can do in terms of their language, in terms of their interactions with other people? Um, what are those micro ways people can work against stigma in faith communities, on a weekly basis?
Hmm. Yeah, it's that's an interesting question because I feel like that touches on the hard part of how you make this all applied. And specifically with regard to language, language evolves so rapidly. It can be hard to know that you are up to date with what people are saying and what's considered, I hate the word politically correct, but like, what's considered socially acceptable nowadays. My advice would be just to check in with people and see if the terminology that you're using is something that they're okay with. A lot of times when I don't know, I preface my statements with correct me if I'm wrong, or I don't know if I'm going to mess this up. If so, I apologize. And sometimes if you just like show that you are human and that you're making your best effort, people will grant you grace. The other thing that I would recommend is working on deep listening. And I say that because oftentimes we think that listening is just about having the right response. But if you're listening to respond and not to understand, there's so much that you can miss, that goes unsaid. And so if we're doing deep listening, we're not just listening for the actual words, we're listening to people's pauses, we're looking at their body language, their affect, and just their general presentation and mood, what the inflection of their voices when they talk about certain people or experiences is all part of communication and deep listening.
That's really helpful. And I think important because for lay leaders and for lay members, these are the people who are really having more interactions with each other than lay people are having necessarily with a pastor on a Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm.
So it matters greatly what is being said from the pulpit, but it also matters how the people sitting next to you on the pew make you feel and what language they use and how they greet you and interact with you. So I think having some kind of practical ways to show up in these faith spaces, even if it's just sitting down next to someone for worship, that presence I think is important. There
Mm-hmm.
is one other
Absolutely.
question. There's one other question that I think you might be able to speak to as well. And then if there are other questions, feel free to email them to us or to send them to the soon to be Dr. Baker. When we think about stigma, particularly around HIV, so much of
Mm-hmm.
this, and I forget which part of the presentation you named this, but so much of this is also about this um, kind of equivocation of, I think you said maybe a just world, right? That there's punishments or consequences to actions.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and so much of the stigma around HIV is promulgated by ethics around what people believe should be sexual practices or use of drugs, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So as we think
Mm-hmm.
about, particularly for this project's sake, destigmatizing HIV, how does that
Mm,
work? We take a few steps back, which really to me sounds like begins with reducing the stigmas we might have around the use of around drug use or around sexuality, or around sexual exploration, etc.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I do agree that social ethics, a lot of it boils down to social ethics, and we get a lot of our social ethics, what we see as right and wrong, from faith communities. And so I think how it's respond to that is to once again encourage people to sort of make sure that they have the full context, because that was sort of the gap in insight that leads to the just world phenomenon, is that we assume that everything that's on the surface that we can see is the complete story. And there's so many aspects of the story that we don't know. Even if you just take one slice of the pie, someone's health, for example, people have different vulnerabilities in terms of their immune systems. We also can't look someone up and down and determine how they contracted HIV, even if they are a group who disproportionately um, contracts HIV because of sexual practices or addiction. We still don't know that that is the reason why. And so I think destigmatization is a lot about reminding ourselves, almost checking ourselves, that we do not have the full story, and we cannot use the missing parts of the story to then victim blame or justify having contempt for someone.
Excellent points, Dr. Araya. And thank you again for a really helpful workshop and for lending your voice to this project, and the larger amount of work that you do, moving all of us toward liberation on a lot of different fronts. So we're grateful for your participation here. Um, I repeat again to you, my sisters and brothers and siblings, that for tonight's resources and for additional resources, you can visit www.iamame.org, and you'll find some workshops of the previous ones, as well as some slides and then other resources. We look forward to seeing you again next week for another broadcast of the Anti-Stigma Series. Until then, stay well.